all do well. So I am here with Catherine Shreves and Elizabeth Glidden. I think you know all of us. More extensive bios are in the Sunday Forum section of this website. But we wanted to start today with a reflection. We know our city is going through a tough time, and so we just thought a moment of reflection and silence. Creator, help us, help the world know justice for George Floyd and all the Black, Indigenous, and brown bodies that have been harmed, especially by state violence. Guide us as we find ways to stand with our neighbors, and today we especially pray for our Pacific Islander and Asian American communities. Help us to be the truest of allies, to speak truth to power, to literally and figuratively have the back of those on the front lines, those who are grieving, and those whose anger over injustice is bubbling over. Help us to understand in the deepest part of our heart and soul that our work is to end white supremacy. May we be voices for justice. Give us strength. Amen. We want to welcome you today to a conversation, and this really is going to be a conversation about reimagining community safety in Minneapolis, as well as the entire state and the country. The issues we're facing here in the city are very challenging, what many call wicked problems, because of the complexity and overlapping levels of authority and responsibility. And Minneapolis is not that different from most other cities in the country, though we do hold the spotlight right now. Please, may we be a beacon of light to others. So I'm here today with, as I said, my fellow Plymouth members. And we want you to know we don't consider ourselves experts, although we do bring experience and knowledge to this conversation. But we are learning along with you what it means to be a good citizen in our city at this time during these challenging moments. And just so you know, the Racial Justice Subcommittee on Reimagining Community Safety is planning a series of community conversations, allowing us to take a deeper dive into the charter amendments, government structures, all the topics that we are looking at between now and the November election. So all those things that are being proposed, and we'll be doing community conversations over the next 4 to 6 months. We're just getting started organizing, so we don't have information on when, but you'll be sure to hear about it. So today, we aren't going to be taking a deep dive into these specific amendments, but we really are here to set a stage to give us an overview of what does it mean to think about reimagining community safety? Why have we shifted the language to community safety instead of public safety? So lots of questions. This week I was reading an email I get every day about peace and justice, and this quote really spoke to me. It's by the author Peter Senge. Dialogue starts with the willingness to challenge our own thinking, to recognize that any certainty we have is at best a hypothesis about the world. So we thought we'd start today with each of us answering the question, what is reimagining community safety? From our own individual perspective, what do those words really mean? So Elizabeth, would you like to start?
Thank you, Anne, and thank you for starting us off as you often do. I just want to say I really appreciate your leadership of our Reimagining Safety group. That has been, I think, an important place for me to be recently. I'm someone who brings experience as a Plymouth member and as a resident of Minneapolis. And then, you know, like many, I bring all sorts of work and community experiences as well. So this is, of course, big question. What does reimagining community safety mean? And as I was continuing to reflect on this this morning, I guess one of the things I wanted to emphasize is that this is not just a philosophical question. This is right now, it's a life and death issue that our Black and our brown neighbors are not safe in our communities, and our white neighbors feel safe in our communities to a great extent. Of course, there's no absolutes to either of those, but I think there's a lot of evidence that supports both those things. And if we're not able to approach this question with some courage in terms of questioning our own comfort level with status quo, then we, I think, are just not participating as members of society, in a sense, of civil society, in terms of trying to understand a perspective beyond our own. When I was reading the news this week, as probably many of you were, one of the things that has stuck in my mind all week was this personal experience shared by a prospective juror in the George Floyd case. And he was a prospective juror that got in the news because he was bumped from the case because he reflected his own personal experience with race and policing. And he said he lived near the intersection where George Floyd was murdered, 38th in Chicago, and that at times the police would ride through the neighborhood playing Another One Bites the Dust. That is something I cannot imagine happening down my personal street, where I will share with you, most of my neighbors are white, and most of those residences there are homes owned by families. So we're coming at this from a place of needing to really think hard about our comfort level. Often, reimagining community safety is words for looking at what are those alternatives to traditional policing. And I'm looking forward to how we are ready to approach this question with courage.
Thank you. Catherine.
Thanks, Elizabeth, for your words. So when I think about reimagining community safety, I think that a lot of people have been saying we'd like to think about it in the same way that we think about public health, that hospitals don't make us well. Living in a healthy community makes us well with good health care and good food. In the same way, police, while they are important to protect us from crime, without the underlying supports to address people struggling with mental illness and addiction, issues of poverty, we are not safe. And I think many of the white people in Minneapolis, and I will include myself in this, have taken comfort in the fact that we see ourselves as a progressive community. And yet we have not been a just community. We have some of the worst statistics on racial inequality in our country. And we've got incarceration rates of Blacks that are 11 times that of whites. I think that, you know, as Elizabeth was mentioning, one of the jurors being questioned, I thought about one of the questions to, I don't know if it was that juror, I think it was an earlier juror being asked, well, do you think that Black people in Minneapolis are arrested at higher rates? Well, they are arrested at higher rates, like 12 times higher rates. But if you answer yes, I think that person got excluded from the jury. So it's a very complicated, it's a complicated issue in our city. It's a complicated issue in our country. And I come to this having served as an activist in Minneapolis for many years, serving on the school board, serving on the charter commission, and most recently this summer was hosting shows on for the League of Women Voters with that included people like Black Visions Collective and Don Samuels, or Stephen Russian, who's an expert on police contracts. I mean, just to try to get an understanding of all of these issues that are playing into this problem that we're seeing right now. It's huge, but when we talk about reimagining community safety, I think it's how do we think about beyond policing, and and I would be the first person to say, and anyway, we need police because we do have problems, but we need to be addressing community safety in a much broader way, and we need our police officers to be working without the kind of bias that our culture has placed on all of us. So I'll end there for now.
So Anne, are you able to answer too?
Yes, I would. You know, my background has been, well, it's a lot, but in my last 10 or 15 years, I've really studied economic inequality, economic justice, and environmental justice. And one of the things that we talk about in the organization I work with, the Science and Environmental Health Network, is that the role of government is to provide for our common wealth and public health. And so our common wealth is what we share together: the quality of our schools, the quality of the air we breathe, the transportation systems we have, our public libraries, a thriving arts community. Those are all the things that we share in a healthy society. And as Catherine and Elizabeth have just pointed out, those aren't shared equally in our community. And so part of our role is to figure out how do we become better, much better quickly, I think, at sharing resources. And then the other piece is to protect our public health. And I think the simplest way for me to think about this is my zip code should not tell you what my life trajectory is going to be, both from a career standpoint and especially from a public health standpoint. So we still have enormous disparities in asthma, in lead poisoning, in life expectancy. If you live on the north side, they don't have as much tree canopy as a lot of the rest of the city. So on a hot summer day, it can literally be 10 degrees warmer there. And that's a life and death question for some people if they don't have a good air conditioning system. But neighborhoods are just, you know, what does the built environment look like? And so there are just so many, many questions. And I think that's one of the reasons this is called a wicked problem. It's not just looking at police. That's a huge piece of what we have to look at right now. But it's that whole systemic system of inequality. And as one of my former mentors used to say, we got here by the rules we made, and we are going to get out of this by changing the rules. And I think that's a lot of our work. And by rules, it can be tax policy, any kind of public policy are the rules that we are currently living under. So what are some ways that the two of you have been thinking about how we might reimagine safety, and why is it important? And just, you know, to think about what are some practical ways or practices that we can all begin to think about as we think about examples of this going forward. What are things we can actually do?
I can start. I think that there's a lot of ground, enormous common ground between police and critics of policing. So I think that if you ask the average police officer, do you want to be the social worker, the medic? Do you want, and they would be saying, no, I'm terrible at that. I really wish there were other people who could do that because that's not what I'm trained to do. And so Hennepin County has had some innovative models that have not yet made it into Minneapolis. They certainly are in 12 other cities, including St. Louis Park, and they are moving into Minneapolis with this program. And it's called an embedded social worker program. And so when somebody would be calling 911 with a mental health issue, they would get directed to a precinct. And this is what's going on in St. Louis Park. They get directed to a precinct, and then the social worker will work with the police to do triage to determine, can I deal with this over the phone? Can I go out on this without a police officer, or do I need a police officer with me? The advantage of using the social workers is they can then follow up, and they do follow up over the next couple of days on stabilization issues, making sure those callers can get on health insurance, that they're taking medication, if they need housing, they can connect them with systems. So that kind of program, I think, is what people are crying out for, rather than having a police response to situations where police are saying, I'm not even really trained to do this. In Minneapolis, we've had what they called the co-responder program, and that was a little bit different. I mean, it was always a police officer going out with a social worker. So I think that got stopped during the pandemic because all the Hennepin County didn't want any of their social workers going into the field. They were just doing remote work. But as my understanding, and I just talked with the woman running this program at the county this week, she said they are going to be restarting this program in Minneapolis, but they're going to be doing it the way they've been doing it in other communities like St. Louis Park. So that to me is reimagining how we respond. But it doesn't deal with the injustices, but it is still working to help people access the supports that they need at the time they need it.
And Elizabeth, if you want to add to that and then lead into the question about, because I'm watching the clock, it goes so fast. You know, we had talked about also addressing why is it important that Plymouth members who are a predominantly white community, why is our engagement important, and how can our whiteness stop us from being a real ally, and where can it really help? So I'll let you kind of decide which direction you want to go in.
You know, actually, I feel like that is good lead into where we need to go, because it is a little bit of where I've taken some of my just practical energy. Is I think in my experience that it's easy for white folks to take a pass on hard questions, where how we enter into the issue may be from a different personal experience than our Black, Brown, Indigenous neighbors within Minneapolis. And we're a very, very segregated city. So I say neighbors in that kind of broad sense because we are a very segregated city. That's been another, I think, just a point that has made these conversations about reimagining community safety very divisive, and that we are coming at this from different points of view and not seeing each other's reality. But I have been working within my neighborhood to say, as white residents, we should not take a pass, that we need to be part of this conversation, and not just a conversation. This is the other thing I think, that for white folks, and often just in general, this conversation reverts to conversations about crime and criminality, instead of focusing back on what is critical issues around race and policing, and the fact that, you know, we are not safe together. White residents are safe. White residents have a respectful relationship with police, and that is not the case for Black and Brown residents in the city of Minneapolis and across the country. Second thing that I have been encouraging folks to do is that I would say is also an issue around thinking about our whiteness is how we think about resource hoarding and how that plays into this conversation. And also how that's part of how we enter into even such practical things as entering into the conversation around the city budget. What gets cut, and does that hurt white residents more or our Black and Brown residents, Indigenous neighbors more? One of the biggest battles I was part of over the years when I was a council member were efforts to eliminate the Department of Civil Rights and to eliminate the health department. And that did not happen, but that was a real conversation. And at that same time, we were not cutting the police department. That was not a conversation. So, Anne, I'm going to turn back to you because I think this is our entree to getting some more input from folks who are part of the audience here.
Definitely. So as John said, the Q&A is where we would like you to type your questions. So please do that. And if you would like to speak, we welcome that too. You just need to raise your hand. And John, I want to say also that John Humphrey is part of our Reimagining Community Safety team. So he may also have a comment he wants to make. One of the things we also would like to know from you is whether there are topics as we begin to initiate these community conversations. What are the questions that you're thinking about, and what are the things you would like to hear? One of the things we know is that we don't all agree on the direction. We all agree on the end product, I think the end vision, but it's really challenging. I feel like every day I'm learning something new, and I don't know as much as Catherine and Elizabeth do about city government. And so I'm really in learning mode, as I'm sure many of you are. So our first question comes from Jane Eichten. Yes, we need policing and cops. What is racist is the system we name the police department. It's the system that's racist, and it seems to me that it needs to go. Numerous attempts of reforming the police department have not worked. It's not guaranteed, but a new public safety department could eliminate some of the racism in the police. Either of you want to? Yeah, Elizabeth, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I will just say I've been part of at least some efforts over the years to create some change within the police department. The city council in Minneapolis only has, so much authority around that, but certainly there are efforts that have happened over the years. By and large, I strongly agree with Jane. I think there have been many attempts to change. Each of those attempts has been hard fought. I will tell you one that's come up time and time again is civilian authority. And whether or not there can be a more robust system of civilian authority to provide oversight and feedback to the police, that has been fought and fought and fought over the years. So this is, I think, is also a big national question, not just a Minneapolis question, about the value of incremental change versus the value of a bigger system change. So I'm glad she raised that.
Good. Catherine, you're on mute.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that too, because I think that it's why people call this a wicked problem. If you get rid of the police, you don't get rid of the police contract. And there are many layers of laws, federal, state, local, that impact policing. And we can't just say, we want to have civilian oversight. We have to go to the state legislature, because there's what's called a law enforcement officer bill of rights that says civilians have no authority over policing. Minnesota's got that law. These are issues, and arbitration. For example, I think when we talk about, and we're all frustrated, we think, can't the police department get these reforms made? Well, yeah, but then when you try to discipline a bad cop, and as you probably saw from this morning's article in the paper where the police officer and the father, who's the retired judge, were sort of having a dialogue about policing. Good cops don't like bad cops. The problem is if the police try to discipline, and they do discipline, oftentimes they're reinstated under the arbitration system. But the third problem, and so those are state law problems, but then there's the local problem of the police contract. And so even if we were to get rid of the police as police and just had public safety professionals, you don't get rid of the police contract. Under Minnesota state law, that's an unfair labor practice. And there are things that we need to address in that contract that should be addressed now. And I could go into those, but I won't bore you. But there are three separate particular things that are really bad. Past practices, which limits an arbitrator's decision when they consider a complaint against a police. Well, if it was allowed 5 years ago, I can't say it's not okay now. I won't go on, but this is why it's called a wicked problem. There are layers of laws that have been put in place over the last 50 years, and we do need to address those at every level of government.
And I just want to go to Seth's comment, and then Myra, I'll go back to your question. Elizabeth's last comments reminded me of Abram Kendi's concept of no neutrality in racism. Laws and systems are either racist or anti-racist. How can there be assistance in helping residents know which laws, policies, and policing regulations might be anti-racist so that we can support them?
Wow, that's a very good question. As with many of these, I don't think there's a simple answer to that, but that is the question that we should be asking. And I think one of the problems is that we have not paid enough attention to some of the things that we kind of take for granted to really have that lens of, is it racist or anti-racist? Mm-hmm. I guess the other framework sometimes I have been turning to is John Powell's targeted universalism. So some may be familiar with this, but it's a theory that says that kind of one size fits all policy, sort of to Seth's point, the neutral policies often do great damage because they reinforced racist application or racist outcomes. Whereas if you have a universal goal, but a targeted approach, that is a better mechanism for ensuring you are not reinforcing racist outcomes. And so I'm trying to fit those two things together. I think, often some of these laws, we have certain laws on the books that are in truth only applied often to disproportionately Black and brown residents, such as our loitering and lurking laws. Mm-hmm. So I honestly, I start there, but I think that is a very rich topic.
Yeah, and I know I've heard, I think it was a conversation, a webinar with Elizabeth Hinton, I think it was her, who is a professor, talk about, some neighborhoods, and you both referred to this, are underprotected and over-policed. And so I think that's one lens to look at how things can change. And it's such a great question, Seth. Myra asks, I would like to hear more about social workers currently being embedded within police departments. Are they available 24/7? Are there statistics on the difference that makes? And I think, Catherine, that's a good one for you.
Well, I'm not sure I can answer that question for you, Myra. I had a long conversation with a woman who is running that program, but I'm not sure if it's running 24/7, but what I do know is what they did, it started as a pilot program in St. Louis Park, and it was so successful that they asked for it to just go permanent before the end of the pilot programming. So I wish I could answer more than that, but I cannot. Sorry.
Elizabeth, do you want to say anything or?
Yeah, I think the intention is that this is a program that grows, that will depend on what happens within the police budget over time. It has been approved over 2 years ago that this pilot would start. And there is some data from other communities, I think, as Catherine said, that shows some effectiveness. So
Great. And the Waterberries are asking, literature and theater are important ways to live other people's experiences. What are you reading? And boy, that would be like a whole Sunday forum. But I think we can type some things in the chat. But I'll just say, obviously, Isabel Wilkerson's new book, Cast, is really a must read. And I think there's an article in the paper right now about a citywide book club around that. Peter Eichten and I are going to be offering a book club conversation for Plymouth members later this summer on When They Call You a Terrorist. And I have found that a critical read for me. She is one of the three members, three women who founded Black Lives Matter, grew up in LA, and really articulates how her neighborhood became, during the war on drugs, a dramatically over-policed neighborhood. And it's pretty painful to read. It's a pretty short book, but I really am recommending that. Do either of you have one you want to? Yep, Elizabeth.
Well, I was going to mention also that Jeff Hall and I are going to be doing a book club for Plymouth members this summer on Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law. And he is going to be speaking at Plymouth next month, April 21st, and we'll post the flyer for that at the end of this program. Also that's April 21st that he'll be speaking, which is, and his book is basically about how federal, state, and local policy has segregated metropolitan areas all over our country in the 20th century. But the week before that, we're going to be focusing just on Minneapolis and the housing segregation that took place in Minneapolis. And that will be April 15th with local historians. Also, all those will be on Zoom. But the other book that I wanted to mention that I just read that I thought was really helpful was called Tangled Up in Blue by a woman named Rosa Brooks. She's a human rights activist and lawyer at Georgetown University, law professor, and she joined the reserve police officer system in Washington, D.C., and then started an innovative program on how you train cadets in policing to talk about all of the things that we're talking about, racism in policing, the culture of policing, and how do you deal with mental health issues, rather than what her training was, which was tactical training. So she's got that program that has started now. That book is, I thought was a great book.
And would you just say a little something about the documentary Women in Blue?
Well, that is low. If you have the PBS app, you can watch that at any time. And it is a discussion among women police officers, following women police officers in Minneapolis. And if any of you don't know, the statistics are that women police officers are much less likely to use excessive force than male police officers. There's a big gender difference. And it's powerful. And Alice, I think it's Alice White, who's an African-American officer on the North Side, said that Minneapolis is a great place to live if you're white. Statistically, we're top in the country, and actually we're pretty much at the bottom in the country if you're not. So that's important for all of us to know, especially in a community like Plymouth. How do we do more than act charitably? How do we start to share power with other communities in our city and make our city a just city so that it's a safe city for all of us?
Thank you. Brian Siska says, Whoops, sorry, John.
Can I intrude a question here? We have
Sure.
in the chat area. It seems like we've lost, if it ever existed, having police responsive to needs of the community. And this seems to tie in with what Catherine was just talking about. Any suggestions how that can be put in place? And maybe I'll add a sub question onto that. Any cities that are doing a better job with police providing community service rather than militaristic policing?
And I'm going to just tack on Brian Siska's questions because they're all of the
Okay.
same context. That's great, John. And if you want me to see your Q&A, it needs to go in the Q&A. If it goes in the chat, I won't see it. So, but John does. So thanks for that. Brian says, I don't hear as much about the culture of policing, which sees Black and brown people as threats, and which also reflects the attitudes of society in general. Culture may be the most powerful force in determining how an organization or institution operates. How does that change?
You're getting at the question. A lot of police officers say, we're just doing what you've told us to do. So this is our problem. This is a community problem. Elizabeth, do you want to, or John, do you want to speak to that?
Well, yeah, I'm sure there are probably folks on this, just because I know there's a lot of expertise at Plymouth and probably folks who have studied a lot about organizational culture. These are big issues. Couple things I wanted to say on this is just, again, more to the reflections issue is one of my most kind of aha moments when I was on the council actually was when I was in a settlement conference. It was a conference settling a case against the city of Minneapolis, which involved a police officer who had engaged in excessive use of force. And he, as he described his history in the Minneapolis Police Department, which was a history of essentially working the night shift in the precinct that covers the North Minneapolis neighborhoods for almost his entire career with the same partner for almost the entire career. It just really came to me that this is my failure as a council member and a failure of the city, that this officer was trained in such a way that his then reaction to society and to those he was there to serve was disrespect, impunity, and so forth and so on. And that he also falsified a report, all these things. That was what we taught him through how he was placed in that department, and what he was taught was good policing. He probably got, awards for that. So we have created this culture. We need to figure out how to undo it. And some of the mechanisms that have been used, we already know are not evidence-based mechanisms. Implicit bias training, we have been told by those who do this work, that is not evidence-based in terms of changing actually the culture and the approach. So thank you for asking that question.
And I think, if you haven't studied the history of policing, it really began in this country as slave patrols. And so while it's certainly evolved, I think we have to go back to what was the foundation and how do we remake policing in a very different way. Barbara Reed, your question about what do we think about the proposed charter amendment from the members of the City Council. As I said earlier, we are going to do a series of community conversations on charter amendments. So we are not going to do a deep dive. I don't know if either one of you want to speak to it briefly, but that really is kind of beyond what we are planning to do this morning.
There's something I wanted to say, not about the charter amendments themselves, because we are saving that. But I think, just to share with those who are listening, that this has been one of the challenges, just even about talking about this topic within this subcommittee, is that we are coming at this. There are very different perspectives on this subcommittee. with regard to what is the best path forward. So this is a point of tension within many points of tension circling this issue, just to be honest about that.
Yeah. And we are learning, I think it's I'll share just a little perspective on, for the last 40 years, it feels like we have kind of lost our capacity to have real conversation. And so I really love, in a way, that we as a congregation are, we had some difficult conversations over the last few years. This is also going to be difficult conversations, and we're all in learning mode. I think it's really an important time for all of us to be thinking deeply, reading, learning from each other. I know I do not have the answers in my head yet. I've got certainly strong opinions about certain things, and then I hear someone else speak and I go, oh, I hadn't thought of that. So I just feel like there's a lot for all of us to learn right now. Catherine, did you want to say anything, or shall we move on to the list of resources, because we're at 10:13?
Well, I think we should move along to the list of resources. And then also, I think that Alex will post the poster on the color of law and the housing crisis programs that we'll be offering. Thanks, everybody, though, for coming. This is top of mind of all of us. I think I counted 5 articles in the newspaper this morning, from the editorial saying public safety is a big deal downtown, we can't ignore it, to the police officer and his father trying to argue about, or trying to have dialogue on something where there is tension, to the book club on CAST, to, I could go on. It's top of mind for all of us, and should be.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
And so thank you all. And this is a list that we put together, and we can mail this out to all of you who are on the team, if we can figure out how to do it. But if you have a phone in front of you or know how to take a screenshot, you could do that. But this is a list of resources that we have all found really helpful. And the Washington Post just in the last week did an amazing series on reimagining public safety, which I encourage you to get your hands on. And then that Tangled Up in Blue, the book, there are some interviews with that author as well as reading it. And then some local resources for the League of Women Voters. Catherine has hosted some conversations as well as others called We the People. And then several other resources, a Mother's Love Initiative, New 612, Reclaim the Block, Black Visions Collective, Yes for Minneapolis. There is just a tremendous community conversation going on right now, and I really encourage you to find those links and begin to do some of that research for yourself. So did I miss anything? And do either of you have any final words before we turn it back over to John? Oh, and there's the flyer for these. Really, these will be amazing conversations in April, and they were supposed to happen a year ago. Catherine had worked diligently, and then something called COVID shut that down. So now we're doing it this year via webinar. So if either of you have a final word, feel free. Otherwise, we'll turn it back over to John. Okay, well, thank you all. We have appreciated, and as I said, this is a beginning conversation. They won't be Sunday forums because those are already full. So we will figure out a way to make these accessible, and we will record them so that if you can't attend at the time, you can go back and watch them later. So watch your inbox.
Okay, so this is the moment at which we get to imagine. There are actually, we have 59 people in attendance today, which is a very good sized crowd for us. We're very happy to have you all here. Thank you. And so this is a chance for Elizabeth and Ann and Catherine to imagine that all 59 of us are wildly applauding you and saying thank you so much for a really outstanding presentation. Okay. Before it goes away, the chat does not get recorded as part of the recording, and there are a couple of resources in the chat that will go away that I might just call your attention to so they don't get lost. A couple of books that people have recommended in addition to what was already shown. A book called Begin Again by Eddie Glaude or Glaude Jr. and Minneapolis, an urban biography, which Seth and someone will be doing a book discussion of coming up this summer as well. So lots of opportunities to learn more about this. The Minneapolis Urban Biography book also contains a fair amount of Minneapolis policies and how the history of policies and how they came into being. So it fits well with this conversation. So again, thank you so much for opening this door and beginning this conversation. And we hope to have more, as Ann was saying, more of these coming up, and we'll keep you posted on those. So with that, a final thing to talk to you about is what's coming up next week. We have a presentation from Dr. Yvette Erasmus, who has been at Plymouth, I think just about as long as I have, and has so obviously, and we pay to keep her around. So obviously she's doing a wonderful job for us. She'll be talking about core commitments of the heart. And so please join us next Sunday for another Sunday Forum presentation from Yvette, Dr. Erasmus. Thank you again so much. It's been a powerful morning. With that, we'll say goodbye.